Alrighty, welcome to part 3 of the DLC Divinity Gabriot Expert Guide to the Hellhorned Clan. Part 3, Spells. And we got a good one here. We're going to have us some fun.
I'm gonna have me some fun. I'm gonna have me some fun.
And I gotta say, I think spells are probably one of, if not the most powerful components to this clan we have come to love and know as Hellhorned. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Yeah, if you could advance that slide, that would be great. Anyway, first one up, Hidden Passage, a real classic. I'm giving this one a 5. That's out of 5, by the way. Flaming balls of flame, 5 out of 5 on those as an average rating. I'm kind of saying the average rating. I'm factoring in like how it does usually combined with what the ceiling might be. And Hidden Passage is just one of the best common spells in the game. It's really versatile. You can never really be wrong to add it. Sometimes there's other choices that make more sense for your deck. Like, ironically, I would say the time I like it least is when I'm running a Shardtail deck. I feel like she needs it the least. But all that being said, it's almost always going to be a good add. The main, the high ceiling effect of it is the ability to overstack your floor. It's one of the easiest ways to do it in the game. It's really nice. It'll you have your floor that's already at the pip limit. You just put a unit below, Hidden Passage it up, it'll come in behind everybody, and now you've gone over the pip limit, and you can keep doing that as much as you want until you get to that 7-unit limit. Very, very powerful. One of the strongest aspects of this game is the fact that by far out of all the clans, they have the easiest, most consistent way to overstack their floors. And then beyond the overstacking, it's just a pretty useful spell in general for displacement. So first and foremost, it's an overstack enabler, but it's also a displacer. So without really putting in the effort to put a diagram up, basically just think of a typical situation where you might have a tank that doesn't really do any damage. Maybe one of those shield dudes that literally has 0 damage. And then you got like the bunch of squishies behind that you can't really kill on an early wave. Well, you can just Hidden Passage the dude in front, and you don't really care since he doesn't do any damage, and you just let him march on up to the pyre while you have a free set of shots on those squishy units. That's not the only way you can displace with it. I mean, you can use it to sometimes just move, say, an Overwatch Charge tank out of a floor that has a bunch of dudes, or like that horrible Sycophant floor, Wave 2, where you got like the spear dude behind a million Sycophants. You can just move him on up if you've already cleared the other Sycophants up, and then he won't get any of that extra damage. Stuff like that, just very, very versatile. Or even just like move a collector up to your top floor or something, even something like that. Or move a collector on the top floor that you're not on up into the pyre room. That's also nice. Artifact synergy, the main one I've listed here is the drop cage. It turns it into basically a Tiresome Climb at that point, for enemies at least. You're still fine on your own guys. And that's a pretty good deal. Daze is super strong in the DLC. Probably one of the most strongest, if not the strongest debuff available. And being able to just add it to Hidden Passage makes it even more kind of a god tier of a card. Another nice thing about it is I'm kind of listing upgrade need here. Like, what do I like? How much do I need to upgrade it to justify it in my deck? Well, this one's pretty low. You don't really need to upgrade it. That's not to say that some upgrades aren't great on it, though. Like most spells, you would love to just take the cost down. Permafrost is probably the most useful upgrade, I would say, on it. And taking intrinsic into factor, I generally would say I wouldn't intrinsic it if I didn't already have permafrost, or if I didn't plan to get permafrost. It's rare. There's exceptions to that rule, but sometimes you just don't have all your banners available to actually overstack on the first turn, so intrinsic can actually hurt you a few times. But you'll know your deck. If you have like Sketches of Salvation, you'd want to intrinsic, and you don't need the permafrost. But generally, if you're going to intrinsic, I'd say snag a permafrost. In general, I'd say snag a permafrost. It's very useful in Hidden Passage. Usually, if your main goal is to use it to overstack, when you permafrost it, it's there for when you need to overstack, and then after you're already overstacked as much as you need to be, the permafrost is nice, and that it basically pseudo removes it from your deck at that point. Once you draw it, you'll stop drawing it in the future, since it's just sitting in hand. That way you don't have to just, keep getting it. Like I said, it's nice for displacement, but it isn't always... There's not always a displacement that needs to happen, and in that case, if you keep redrawing it, it's kind of a dead draw past the opener. And holdover is specific to decks that really just kind of hyper overstack, right? Like if you want to, or also alternatively, if you have the drop cage, it's definitely a good holdover target. But in a general sense, I wouldn't say holdover is necessarily something you need to target for Hidden Passage. But that's Hidden Passage. Very, very good spell. If you haven't been using it, you're blowing it. You're just blowing it. You start using this spell. It's amazing. And Vent, another very good common. I give it a slightly less of an average rating. Not that it's necessarily worse. I just don't feel like the ceiling is there. But in a general sense, it's always going to be useful. One thing I will say is I think the upgrade need is very high on this for it to find use, especially past the first couple of rings. It has probably the worst X cost effect in the game. If I'm thinking in terms of like what does my Ember actually do to this X cost. 2 damage per Ember is an abysmal return on spending Ember on this thing. So it's kind of a weird card in that sense, right? Like the main power is actually just playing it at 0 when you're already spent all your Ember, and then applying flat damage upgrades to make it just 4-0, do a bunch of flat damage to a floor. And in that sense, I think I generally would rather have the Divine Temple upgrades if I can. Surge Stone is more specific to if I had started with 2 vents, like in my opening offerings, or not offerings, but just what's included in my deck at the start of a game. Generally, if I'm adding vent to my deck, I wouldn't really want to Surge Stone it unless I had to. Probably adding it to have it as my AoE specific option. And in that case, I'd really want either of these, but 10 also works. And Holdover is an option too, especially if your deck just needs it. Along with AoE, I listed this as damage mitigation because, it's unlike something like Inferno, you can play it on your floor, and it's saving a lot of damage to your frontliners, especially if you're going to face something like Shade Wings. If Seraph the Temperament or Seraph the Patient is in your future. So it's definitely good for damage mitigation. Also for artifacts, it's odd because I specifically didn't list First Hell Pact, which is the artifact that gives you +3 to your X cost, because like I said, all that represents here is an extra 6 damage, which I think is pretty negligible in the grand scheme of things. Really, the artifacts that, like Event, would just be Split Anvil. You'll see Split Anvil show up a lot for Hellhorned. It is probably, I would say it's the best in Hellhorned. Very good artifact in general, but for Hellhorned, this is just a top tier add. I'd almost always add it unless there's just a huge reason to add something else. And also, this is the basically when you have that cavern event, when you can either add pip to all floors or 3 to 1 floor, or you can lose a pip and get 15 spell damage. That works pretty well with Vent as well, because like I mentioned, flat damage is what you're looking to add to the spell. That's pretty much the gist of it. You want flat damage. You're generally wanting to play it at 0, unless you're doing Split Anvil. Because and by the way, I don't know if I mentioned it, the Split Anvil works with X costs in the sense that whatever Ember you played it at, it's going to treat it as that. So say you're at 3 Ember, you play Vent, everything 2 Ember and below is now going to go to 0 with Split Anvil. And that's Vent. Then we go to Hornbreak. Now Hornbreak, so Vent and Hidden Passage were always good, but prior to the DLC. Hornbreak I felt was kind of mediocre prior to the DLC, and maybe based on my rating it seems that way, but I think 3 stars in my eyes is above average. I would say 2-star is kind of mediocre in my rating system. So I actually think in the DLC, Hornbreak slightly got better. I mean, obviously it just got better because the text was changed to just deal 5 damage twice instead of once. But I think the fact that there's so much spell shield, there's so much damage shield, and also there's just so much health now in backliners, this becomes significantly more useful in the DLC compared to what it was before. I will say at 10 damage, it's still usable, especially in the early to mid game, but if you plan on still having it be relevant by late game, the upgrade need does go up, I would say. I mean, obviously it just needs some flat damage upgrades is what it needs. And actually, the Divine Temple 30 I find is amazing on this card. If you can get, I even put 2 of these on it sometimes if I can. At that point, it won't like kill late game tanks, but it'll put a pretty good amount of damage into those tanks if you need it, and it's often enough to kind of finish it off or prep it to be finished off. And then, as always, it'll, especially at that, it's obviously going to kill any backliner, even with any amount of it's piercing, so armor doesn't matter. But if they had, some of those backliners have 25 to 30 health sometimes, and they won't be surviving that. Even with 10, they're probably not surviving it because you're doing 30 at that point. So 10 is just fine. Also, if you have a few of them, or if it's just not a main part of your game plan, Surge Stone is just fine. It's doing 50 damage at that point. 50 piercing damage, I might add. And along with being a single target nuke, remember it's also useful for self-sacrifice. So often with imps, you're going to want that. And also if you have Remnant, Melting Remnant involved in your clan combo, you're probably going to want it a lot of the time. And Hornbreak is a very good card at that, doing that. It's very versatile in that way. Artifacts, I only listed this one. There's obviously other spell damage artifacts as well, but I think in the DLC, most of those are so weak that they kind of just are negligible, but this is one where you'd actually see actual value out of it. So that's Hornbreak. I think it's pretty middle of the road to slightly above middle of the road. I think it's a pretty good card now, but I'm not always adding it. Let's put it that way. If I have like a vent, I often just don't need it, but if I don't have a vent, Hornbreak can work. It's not going to give you AoE, but it'll help. And Fortify, I don't value this card very high. I never have really, even before the DLC, and I don't think it's particularly any more or less useful now. Early game, it can be okay, and in some specific situational decks, like an incant deck, it's fine. It could be okay for an Apex Imp. It's at that point, it's pretty good value for 0 Ember, but outside of those specific situations, I just don't think it's very good. I think it's so low impact that it's just not good enough for Covenant 25 play, especially with the extra difficulty that these shards brings, and I don't think it really gains a whole lot from some of the additional Divine Temple stuff that's available. So I often am, if this is, I'm rarely adding it to a deck. Usually it's just in my opener, and it's usually a good Purge Stone target for me. It's at a certain point because it really just doesn't serve much of a purpose to my decks. That being said, Railhammer can make it a lot more decent. At that point, you're applying 9 armor. That can be okay defensive scaling at that point. And for what it's worth, it doesn't really need upgrades. I mean, you could double stack it if you really wanted to, but I don't know. I think you're pretty desperate if you're doing that, but it is an option, I guess. I don't target Fortify though. I think it doesn't lead to consistent wins. Now, Ritual Battle. This is one where, if you follow my channel, I'd historically slept on it in my early part of my Monster Train career, but granted, it used to suck. It was like Rage 6 or something, but now it's Rage 10. That was before the DLC too. For the record, I got to the point where I loved this card even before the DLC, and I think it's even more powerful in the DLC just because there's so much additional ways to make it work. I typically was only using it just with the double Emberstone upgrade. I listed it twice here just to iterate that you're often, a super solid play is to take it with the intent to, as soon as possible, prioritize just getting 2 Ember upgrades on it. At 1 Ember, it's super useful. Obviously the role is offensive scaling. I put the upgrade need as very high. At 3 Ember, it's very lackluster, I would say. Unless you're running something like a Split Anvil or a Volatile Gauge. even then, with Volatile, I'd probably still slap some Ember Stones on it. But I think it's a 5-star card. I think it's just one of the most solid bread and butter scaling cards in the game. You add one or two of these, get them upgraded. They're also a good Hellvent target at that point. Any sort of decent backliner is going to wreck face with this. And with it, when you factor in Divine Temple, I listed these holdover and double stack. I put it down here attached to Valio's Stone because I don't really like running double stack on it if it's going to cost me 3 Ember still. Similarly, even like a 1 Ember Stone and a holdover I don't love. Obviously, it can work sometimes, so you could throw it up there. But typically, if I want to add double stack or holdover, I'd like to just get the Value Stone on it prior to know that these are going to be not too bad. Like double stack at 2 Ember is not too bad. I mean, that's 20 rage for 2 Ember. That's definitely worth it. And also just 1 Ember but hulled over is also very good, very nice. So that's Ritual of Battle. Very, very good. If you haven't been using it, start using it. It is amazing. And, I thought I'd list Torch. It's technically not a card that you can add, but it is a spell. It's listed as a common, even though I refer to it as a basic, since that's what it is. I gave it an average rating of 2 in the context of it being a basic. I actually think it's slightly underrated. It's not great, don't get me wrong. It may not even be good, but it works. Like, I would say the upgrade need is medium to make it work. At 2 damage, it's pretty useless. But, it's still a single target nuke, especially if you can add some piercing or 30 magic power if there's nothing better to put it on. And if you need that role filled, it can fill that role. It's also a pretty good self-killer. As we've mentioned, imps often want to get killed, especially like a welder helper. You want to play it in the back often, but you don't really want it just sitting around taking up floor space. So in that case, Torch is great for it. And also Melting Remnant, often just killing off some of your own units, is something you want to do, and Torch is great for it. You could also self-killer, you could even lump in revenge triggers there. Torch, even unupgraded, is pretty good for revenges. So, Wrathful Prince, if that's something you did. Or even something like some extra Frostbite stacks out of a Frost Shark, stuff like that. And yeah, so just any sort of flat damage upgrades will make it a pretty decent card because, you can target where it goes. You can kill a backliner with it. That's not a bad deal for a basic. There's a lot of basics that do a lot worse. But obviously it's a great Purge Stone target as well because you don't really want a lot of them in your deck. This artifact, by the way, is very good with it. Turns if you still have all your torches or a few of them, now they're all able to kill backliners at that point, and that's a pretty good deal. So this artifact is definitely the best synergy with Torch. But that's Torch. I think it's slightly underrated, but not great. And now we're getting to the uncommon tier. And by the way, I should mention every card that we just went over, it had the uncommon sort of the white dot in the middle here. Now we're to the blue dot, which is the uncommon rarity. So everything in that white dot, minus Torch, of course, is only offered in the first 2 rings. So that's worth mentioning. Beyond the first 2 rings, you're only going to see blues and purples, so uncommons and rares. That can be worth game planning around. If you don't have a ritual now, you may not necessarily get super good rage scaling, but we'll get into all that later. So anyway, Tiresome Climb. It was always decent, but it was not. I would never have rated this 5 prior to the DLC. Post DLC, I damn near want to give it a 6 out of 5, but that's not mathematically possible, so we're left with 5 out of 5. But honestly, it is so god tier. It's one of the best cards in the game. It's, like I said, Dazed is so useful in the DLC. Like, the fact of the matter is, with these sharded up enemies, it's just often too hard to defensively scale good enough to survive them, and especially some of the bosses. And dazing is just the best way to deal with that. just say fuck it to your defensive scaling and just don't let the enemy attack. That's a great option. And also specifically for Divinity, Dazed is very good, especially if you really want to go top floor. Something like Tiresome Climb has the nice ability to, you can just play it on the enemy, daze Divinity for however long. But it's also, much like Hidden Passage, it is an overstack enabler. It's not as good as Hidden Passage at that, obviously, since it costs more and you daze your own unit. That being said, if I didn't hit on Hidden Passage, I'll take Tiresome Climb and use it to overstack. But that being said, I'll take Tiresome Climb almost just snap pick these days. I don't even think that's a bad idea. Sometimes there's something better that'll be there, but I don't think, if you don't have a daze option in your deck and you see Tiresome Climb, even if you don't think you need it right now, I would take it for later. It's so useful, specifically for the Divinity fight, if anything. But honestly, you'll be surprised at how many times, since I recommend typically setting up top floor, even doing something like, let's say there's a backliner that for whatever reason you couldn't kill, you can just bring it up to the Pyre room, let the Pyre kill it for free. And that can be relevant. I mean, sometimes like these sharded up Shadewings are doing over 50 damage. And that's a lot of damage to take if you didn't have the card otherwise. And also, since you're set up top, you can just use it on the boss, especially if you got it permafrosted. I highly recommend permafrost on it. And then the boss is dazed. And then you get a free extra 2 shots, extra 4 shots if you got double stack, or the drop cage, which is of course great with it. Split Anvil is also decent with it too. Remember, it's any 1 cost it's gonna bring down to 0. So it fills just a lot of roles. It can overstack, it can displace, obviously, and damage mitigation because of the dazed. Incredible card. And I would say unupgraded, it's still great. So I didn't say it was necessarily a high upgrade need, but I would say if I listed something separate like upgrade priority, I'd say it's high, because it just gains a lot from all of these upgrades. Making it free makes it great. Having an intrinsic to guarantee you can set up top floor is amazing. Having it permafrosted so you can do what I said, like against the bosses, or just have it in general around for when you need it. Double stack, make the dazed more, that's great. Any of these upgrades are going to make it even that much better. So Tiresome Climb, in the Divinity DLC world now, one of the best cards in the game. Inferno as well, it was always good, but I think it has similarly kind of gained value in the DLC. There's so many floors of just awful, just wide high threat stuff going on, especially in the Divinity fight. And being able to just sort of delete most of the floor turns out to be a pretty good deal. Upgrade need, I probably should have listed this as like low to medium. I actually don't think it necessarily needs upgrades. The main problem is just the Ember cost. So like if you have Ember issues, which sometimes you do, it'll be a high upgrade need. Obviously at 3 it's a bit awkward to play, so just an Ember Stone or 2 is great. -2 is very good on it. Also permafrost, just having it around when you need it is great. I'd say the biggest example of when I like to have Inferno is to take care of that double overstat, the double, what do you call them? Why am I drawing a blank on them? The tank that harvests, overcharge tank. So there's that it's like wave 3 or whatever in the Divinity fight. You often face a double overcharge tank floor with another tank behind him, and then like a Wilt Wing in front and a Spike Enchanter behind. Inferno can make that floor so much less of a threat. And just any of those floors, but specifically that floor I really like Inferno for. It doesn't always make sense to add Inferno to a deck, but if you do add it, it's going to do work for you. And especially if you're just setting up top, it's more awkward if you have like a 2-floor setup. I just find I'm rarely doing that anymore. And if you're typically just setting up on the top floor, it's really nice to be able to just clear stuff on the bottom before it gets to you. And then Enflame, oddly enough, I hated on this card a lot prior to the DLC, and I still don't think it's a good card, but I do think it slightly got better in the Divinity DLC. My reasonings for that is mainly because Value Stone exists. That's really it. That and the fact that I think it's just generally easier to have higher Ember in a general sense. So you can justify the double stack a bit more, because when it's double stacked, it doesn't suck. It's not great, but I mean, one card getting you 8 rage and 10 armor isn't that bad of a deal. It just sucks that you have to invest so much in it to get it there. But really, if I'm adding I'm never adding Enflame in a general sense. If I'm adding Enflame, it's because I don't have something like a Ritual of Battle. I don't, mainly for the rage, I'd say, is what I'm adding it, but also sometimes for the armor. If I'm like really hurting for survivability, sometimes I'll add it for that as well. But this is, don't get me wrong, Enflame is the fallback plan. It is not your go-to. I don't base a deck around Enflame unless it's my last resort. Shout out to Papa Roach. But that's why kind of the 2-star rating and the upgrade need is high. If you're adding this, you're not adding it just to have a crappy 2 Ember card that doesn't do much. You're really looking to double stack it. And you're really looking to get that Ember cost down. And it'll provide you both that offense and defense scaling at that point. Hell, you may even overstack it and double stack it with like a split anvil or something weird like that. That's not out of the question. But that's Enflame. Branding Rite. Here's one where I think prior to the DLC, I'd give this like a 4-star rating. I think it lost a bit of value in Divinity DLC for a few reasons. I think just in general, the defensive scaling it provided isn't fast enough in the DLC to keep up with what is needed to survive. On top of that, I think the offensive capability of it, before it would kill basically any backliner in the game. Now it won't kill any backliner in the game, late game with shards, right? Other than a spawned Lightwing from Seraph is all it will kill. That's it. Unless you want to give it plus damage at that point, I don't know. I would rarely do that. I would really only add it for the defense, and I just don't think it's that good of a defense card anymore. That being said, I gave it I was going to give it a 2. I gave it like a soft 2.5 star. It's kind of like the faded thing there, the faded flame there. If you do add it, it needs upgrades. It's really unexciting at just 2 Ember and essentially gain 15 armor. Not only is it gain 15 armor, outside of something like Awoken where you can heal it back, it's like a lot of your units in the Hellhorned specifically just don't have high health totals, and you're kind of limited on how many times you can play it. So that also further kind of hurts it. All that said, though, it's still a pretty good defensive scaling option. Much better also with Railhammer. I don't typically double stack and hold it over unless I have something like a, split anvil, but usually I want one or the other. I either have a frontliner that has enough health or healing and whatnot that it makes sense to like take it down to 1 Ember or 0 and just hold it over. Or alternatively, if I don't want to do that, I would double stack it just for like a one-time armor boost whenever I see the card, instead of holding it over. I find the next, spoiler alert, the next part of the guide, part 4, is going to be the champions. And I think another reason it's gone down for me is like Wrathful was such a good path to me prior to the DLC, and now I think it's a pretty bad path. And Branding Rite was just so god tier in the Wrathful path. You get a decent amount of health buffer with the Wrathful path, and just getting the armor on top of getting just revenge triggers was pretty nice to have. And now it just doesn't get that, because Wrathful I'm just rarely going. But anyway, that's Branding Rite. It's still okay defensive scaling. I don't find myself adding it that much to my decks anymore. March of Shields, I think it's about as useful as it was before. Maybe I'm underrating it, but I figured it was just about a 3. I'm often able to just not need it the way I construct my decks, even in an overstacking situation. I'm usually able just to get the tank I want in front first. And at that point, if I have no reason to shuffle, I think as an armor gaining card, it's pretty lackluster. 1 Ember for 10 isn't that exciting. That being said, though, if you do need defensive scaling, it could work. It's also a little bit versatile in that even beyond the most classic reason to have it in your deck, which is like you overstack a floor, but you can't necessarily get your tank on the floor first. In that case, you can just shuffle the tank to the front. That's like the most classic use. You can also use it to shuffle just the tank that you want to use. So sometimes, let's say you have a floor with like a bunch of Keeper of Echoes on it, and the one in front is like just getting hurt and hurt. You could just bring another Keeper of Echoes to the front and have it start tanking damage, and then the other one doesn't have to end up dying that way. So you can do that. That's especially useful if you want to do the spell chain route. And also, you can displace enemies with it. Don't forget, you can target an enemy with it. Yeah, it'll give it 10 armor, but in a lot of cases, that just doesn't matter. Like, sometimes you just, like, if you have a unit that has quick, but it's just a single target striker, and you need to mitigate the damage from some super shade wing, right? That's plenty fine play to make, is to march it forward and have your quick unit kill it before it does 50 damage to your dudes, right? Permafrost, it loves to have permafrost. Have it there when you need it. That's I'd say it's a high upgrade need. Without permafrost, I don't think it's very useful. If I don't plan on permafrosting it, I'm almost like, why would I have it in my deck? That's almost kind of my feeling on that. Emberstone is still fine on it too. It's a lot better. It's a lot less awkward to play if it doesn't cost anything. Since it might be played often, Railhammer could be good too. And Spell Chain's nice too, because you can do things like put armor on a backliner to have them survive either a sweeper or spikes. But then since you spell chain it, you can then play it the second proc of it on the tank to bring the tank back forward, just so the backliner isn't stuck in the front. So that's actually the use for spell chain in a general sense. Also, if you don't need to do that, it basically is a pseudo overstack, especially if you Emberstone it. It will only cost 1 in total, and you can get 20 armor to your frontliner that way. That's not a bad deal. And Intrinsic, I would say, similar to like Hidden Passage, I would only really do that if I'm permafrosting it. But then it's just there, so when I overstack, I don't have to wait and get in an awkward situation where I don't have my tank in front. But that's Martial Shields. I think it's pretty good, but not necessarily insanely good. It fits a specific role, and if it doesn't do that, it's just not really making its way into my decks. Then Battering Ram is similar. It's like, when it makes sense, it's very good. When it doesn't make sense, it's not. Giving it kind of just a middle-of-the-road average rating in my book. Because even in the insane cases, typically it's only just killing one unit. So a lot of that damage is wasted, a lot of that extra damage. But if you can get a nice clean shot on the boss, it can be a boss finisher, especially in like a Stygian deck where you have spell weakness and just a bunch of armor incanting going on. I typically think it does have a decent need for upgrades. I mean, it does what it does without any upgrades, so in that sense it's not necessarily a high upgrade need, but it sure would love to be cheaper, and it sure would love to be permafrosted so you can use it when you need it, I think. In rare cases, I could see holdover working too, if it's just, if it's not like high cost to play it through something like a split anvil or some other means, or a value stone or something. Maybe having it every turn would work, but I'm typically not holding it over, so I didn't feel like I should put it in the Merchant of Magic. But for the record, you can hold it over as well. I put Railhammer here. Obviously, it doesn't have any direct help to Battering Ram, but kind of tertiary, I guess. Like, if you're able to just help stack a bunch of armor fast on your floor, it's going to make Battering Ram obviously hit harder, so I think it has synergy with it in that sense. But anyway, that's Battering Ram. I would like it more if it just kind of had some trample effect, but it's still pretty good. It's basically kind of almost like a crit builder that doesn't have the luxury of offering, needs armor on the floor to use, but at that point it's just hitting the front dude huge. And then we got Rage Serum. I really don't value this card. I hardly ever add it to a deck. Similar to Fortify, it just isn't impactful enough to justify a card slot, in my opinion. It's 0 cost, but 3 rage is just nothing. Even if you double stack, it's not that good, in my opinion. like for instance, if you double stack it, it doesn't even reach the rage that say Dark Deal already does. I just don't think it's ever worth including. Maybe if you're super, super, super desperate for rage and you have something like a repeater Echo Rite, maybe it can work. Even then, I'm like, I don't know, it just feels pretty low value to me. But maybe it works if you don't have a better target for repeater Echo Rite. Maybe it works. I also did say I listed this Trader's Quill, the one that does 30 damage to the front unit when you play a consumable card. I think maybe in some rare cases I'd be inclined to, if this was like in my opener, pick this artifact, or alternatively, if I had this artifact but nothing to really combo with it early game specifically, I might take a Rage Serum just to, because I mean at 0 cost to do 30 to the front is pretty good early game, admittedly. But all that being said, I'm never like pouring upgrades into it. I just think it's such a bad card. And Impressive, of the Imp cards, I am least impressed, shall we say, with this one. By a pretty good margin. It's not that it's a bad card. I don't know. Like, maybe it's just my luck of the draw. I feel like it's often included in my opener, and then I just don't really end up with enough imps to make it do much. And like, unlike the other imp cards, I feel like it just doesn't do as much. It's basically doing as much damage as like a Titan Scrat. It does a little bit more, but for the purposes, for all intents and purposes, if you're adding damage and whatnot, it's attuned. Like, I assume you're probably adding it. If you are adding it to your deck, it's either because you don't have a good way to sacrifice an imp, or you need a front-loaded nuke, or both. But if you're adding it for the front-loaded nuke purpose, you sure would be inclined to add some spell damage, obviously, right? But then also Purge Stone in the case that you just don't have nukes, or that you don't have imps, which I don't know, for whatever reason is often the case when I have Impressive in my opener. But anyway, that's kind of impressive. Imp-Sickle obviously is nice with it, because then you have a guaranteed target. And then, 15 spell damage, which translate to 15 by 5 damage, 75 or whatever that is. A lot of damage. But then we get on to what probably my favorite of the Imp Synergy cards, which is Imp-Portant Work. And it even got nerfed in the DLC, and it's still God tier, I'd say. I gave it a 5-star, even though technically there could be decks where you don't have imps and it doesn't work. But I don't know. I feel like the ceiling is just so consistently there when you have imps that it felt wrong not to give it 5-star. It's even, being able to spell chain it makes it even more insane. Like, the main thing is like, yeah, you can use it to card draw. It's good for that, dig through your deck. But I like it even better on just an endless imp, because it fires that endless imp right back into your hands, so you can just keep playing the same imp for as many important works as you have. So like, I love holdover and spell chain on it. You can play a Transcend Imp, or just even some, like a Fledgling Imp that's endless. Any good endless imp, you can just play it over and over again. And it's such a powerful play, especially in the case of Transcend Imp, where usually I have something infused into the Transcend Imp, like a Queen's Impling or a Fledgling Imp. And then that summon effect is continuing to stack onto the Transcend Imp's sort of ever-growing stack of summons for that fight. And I don't know, it's just so good. And obviously Imp-Sickle's great for it, because you always have a guaranteed target. I would say the upgrade is medium. It just, priority is high. I think if you find holdover, put it on Imp-Portant Work. I can't think of many other things that want it more, similar with Spell Chain. But the need isn't necessarily high. Even if you don't have holdover or Spell Chain, it's still going to be good in your deck. It's still going to, basically draw itself out. So it's almost, as long as you have consistent imps, it's really no downside to have it in your deck. And it even gains an Ember. So, very good card. Imp-In-A-Box also is very good. I think it's even better in the DLC. When you factor in things like Wormkin Clan can return consumables so easily, or the fact that Spell Chain exists. I think it's such a good spell chain target. Now the thing about it is like, its roles, I just listed it as Transcendent Fuel. So like, Often you don't have all the types of various imps in your deck, but with an Imp-In-A-Box, you could get something like a Pyre Chomper, which now makes your Transcendent super easy to play. Because now you're getting a bunch of Ember. Keep in mind, they obviously nerfed Transcendent to 2 Ember, which can be awkward sometimes to play on Endless, especially if you have a few of them. But if you can just get a single Pyre Chomper played through Imp-In-A-Box, then you're good. Similarly, if you didn't have any rage, you could find like a fledgling imp, or if you didn't have any armor, you could find a welder helper, and now you have that every turn. And also, even beyond that, it just has good general use. It's very variant in what you're going to get, but it might give you an ember boost, it might give you some armor, it might give you some rage, it might just give you some AoE. Sometimes it might even give you a Transcendent. There's just a lot or sometimes it can just give a consume back, right? There's so many things it can do. So in a general sense, it's just going to be useful. But the best case scenario, I think, is combining it with Transcendent. Spell Chain's great with it, by the way, especially in the Transcendent case. I'd say in either case, just because it literally doubles the effect of the card. You're going to get 4 imps from it. Even more if you have consume return mechanics of any sort. So I don't know. It's a 5-star for me. Upgrades similar to actually the last card we talked about, Imp-Portant Work. It doesn't need upgrades, but it sure would love them. You know, making it able to play more often with the Eternal Stone or the Spell Chain. Just having it, like we said, give 4 imps instead of 2. Very, very good. But it doesn't need them. It's great without them too. Now we're getting to the rares. First one we're going to go over here is the Spike of the Hellhorned. I think that it's slightly better in the DLC than it was. I never thought it was very good. I still don't think it's very good. But I think that it has, as I've said, there's more ways to gain Ember, I feel, now in the DLC. So the highest, I think, value you ever get from it are those weird decks where you can gain a ton of Ember on some given turn. And in that case, it's like a hyperscale. You can gain a lot of rage, and I guess armor. I think you're less worried about the armor. I think if you're doing this, it's probably for the rage that you want. It's also very good with, I think, Apex Imp, because obviously you basically get 4 times rage. But I think beyond the hyperscaling, it can be useful just as like a low investment incant or consume proc. Because you can play it for 0, right? And especially if you have a value stone or ember stone on it, you can play it for 0 and still get some value out of it. So in decks that have etch, for example, it's an easy etch to make that can also give you some value. In decks that have incant, it's an easy incant you can make, and it can still get you some value. If I'm double stacking it, I usually want to have either like this first hell pack with it, or have it be like a hyperscale type deck, because then you're getting, obviously double for that ember. And also in those cases, I would permafrost it probably. So if I'm going to double stack it, I probably want to combo it with permafrost, because I'm obviously trying to have some big turn happen when I have a bunch of ember. But that's Spike of the Hellhorned. I do think in a general sense it still sucks. Because, 2 rage and 2 armor per ember is not a great... That's basically Enflame unupgraded level of value, which is not good, right? Then we have Dark Deal. I think Dark Deal slightly got worse in the DLC. But just slightly. I think it's still a great card. I'd probably have rated it 5 prior to the DLC. I thought it was one of the best scaling cards in the game. I think it's still just a pretty good scaler, but for whatever reason, I don't know. I feel like the 5 damage to your own unit is a little bit harder to deal with now, I feel, especially when you have to deal with so much spikes and tramplers. So it becomes a little bit more of a liability in that sense. I also think it lost value in its versatility to kill enemies because, as I've mentioned with like Branding Rite before, you could kill almost every backliner in the game at 5 damage, save purifiers, right? But now it kills nothing. So it's really just a scaling card that has a cost associated with it of health. But all that being said, that's still not a bad deal, shall we say? Dark deal, not a bad deal. Dark equals not a bad. Anyway, Rage 7 though is very good to get for 0 Ember. Especially, and double stack is great. I think you can still hold it over if you can justify that health loss. And then obviously any sort of rage artifacts are good. I also said be wary of adding this with this artifact. Or any, I guess, you can put Dante's Cloak there as well. Like, Dark Deal, not the greatest to scale Dante with, because it's going to do 20 damage to yourself. Something to keep in mind. I typically am not using Divine Temple upgrades on it. I guess you could spell chain it if you can deal with that damage, but now you're looking at 10 damage to yourself on that turn. It could work. Spell chain is probably the one I would target. I mean, it's the only one that really makes sense, right? But the upgrade is at least low on it. You really don't have to upgrade it, and it does pretty good work. Particularly if you don't have like ritual. I find if I already have a ritual, I'm less adding this to my decks anymore. But if I didn't find ritual, this is like probably the prime target I'm looking for to just get sort of get off the ground running with rage generation. Then Alloy, I think this had a slight boost in the DLC. What you want from defense is high impact cards now, and this is one of them. I mean, 25 armor for 1 Ember is high impact at pretty good efficiency cost. Even better if you can double stack it. Alternatively, if you can remove the consume, either through upgrades or Wormkin shenanigans, it becomes quite nice. The upgrade need, for that reason, I would say, is medium. Like, you could maybe argue low. I mean, at 1 Ember and 25, it's still a fine card, but it's just a one-time play with a consume. You're going to want to at least probably double stack it or remove the consume if you can. And then the roll, obviously, is just defensive scaling. And then the wing clipping artifact is quite nice with it. I typically don't add any Divine Temple stuff to it, though. I guess if I double stack it, I might want to -2 it. That's totally fine to do. But typically, I just don't find myself using Divine Temple upgrades on the Alloy. Imp-Olate is obviously very good in an Imp deck and useless outside of it. But I mean, if you are exiled Hellhorned, you naturally just have around 100, at least 100 damage from it typically. And even if you aren't exiled Hellhorned, if you added, you're typically adding things like Fledgling Imp and Wilder Helper to your deck if you can find them. And in that case, it'll do maybe 80 to 100 damage, which is still great for 1 Ember. And also, if you want to wear like stuff like Imp Sickle or even Queen's Imp Parade on the Shardtail Queen, every imp those add in that fight does count toward this total. So you will naturally scale up the damage of this throughout the fight with those. And it really needs no upgrades. I mean, maybe you hold it over if you really need that front-loaded nuke every turn, but I'm rarely doing that. Spell Chain also makes sense. You can kill basically 2 tanks with it if you have enough imps, or if you don't have necessarily that many imps, it'll kill 1 tank at least late game. But that's Imp-Olate, not necessarily a whole lot to go over there. You either have imps or you don't. If you have them, great. It does a ton of damage for high efficiency. If not, you just don't add it. And then Last Stand, this one I think got a huge boost in the DLC. I rated it 5 here because I just find almost I can almost justify it in every deck now. It's so much easier to get to work. I find I generally just have an easier time generating rage, and I just generally have an easier time playing this or just making it broken. Wormkin loves this card, especially Echo Rite Repeater. Even beyond that, though, just Wormkin Etchings or Broken Memories is literally, as the name implies, quite broken. If you can get Last Stand every turn, there's not much. As long if you have like a quick on any of those units, especially if there's like a quick sweeper, endlessly give Last Stand every turn to it through any of these methods. It's just insane. Nothing's gonna stop you. And there's a lot of artifacts that combo well with it. Split Anvil is obviously very good. The chance to not consume it is good. And then obviously any sort of rage helps. I like to permafrost it. I like to remove the consume. I like to make it cheaper. And Spell Chain's not bad either. It's kind of like a pseudo Hellvent in that regard. But one that doesn't cost you 2 draws, shall we say. Or 2 includes in a deck. Upgrade need is high though. I mean, it really does want upgrades to truly shine. Without any upgrades, it can be awkward, but it's still, it's still okay unupgraded. If you got Rage, and even if you play it for a high amount one time and that's it, that's still a very high value play. And as we've kind of, I don't know if I talked about days, but I think even beyond days, I just find offense is so much more needed than defense these days in the Divinity world. Particularly if you have quick on any units, the best way to deal with the high amount of damage coming in is just to simply kill them before they get to you, and something like Last Stand does a pretty good job at that. And then we have Reinforce, which I also think got a decent boost in the DLC. I hardly ever used this prior to the DLC. Now I'll use it from time to time. I do think it's still in the situational tier, whereas Last Stand, I think, has moved from the situational tier to the almost always good tier. But Reinforce, I think, is still situational. Unlike Last Stand, it doesn't do it to the whole floor. It just does it to one unit. That being said, it can still be pretty good. This is the type of card, defensive-wise, that can make defense still work. Because there's a lot of easy ways to get armor, and if you have any of them, that's, by the way, why I listed Railhammer there. It doesn't actually have any synergy directly with this. It's just kind of indirect synergy. If you have, good armor generation, well, this can basically solidify particularly the Relentless rounds, but in some cases you also need it just to survive against the waves, since there's so much damage coming in. But very, very good. Apex Imp loves it. Split Anvil loves it. Similar upgrades, but basically the same upgrades apply here that you would see on Last Stand. And essentially it's just Last Stand but defensive, and it's just, I guess, not as good because defense isn't as good as offense, and the fact that it doesn't do your whole floor. That's really the only difference, I would say. And then the final one we have here is Onehorn Tome. It was actually a little bit difficult for me to evaluate it because I don't know. It's a weird one. I think it's severely underrated right now. I get the general sense that people don't seem to like it, and I think that's just wrong. This, similar to Last Stand, I think you can consistently make this work, but it does require. I put the upgrade as very neat. The upgrade need is very high, obviously, because at 5 Ember, it is unplayable in a lot of decks until you can get some upgrades on it. So you have to get definitely some upgrades on it, Ember-wise. It also loves to have something like a double stack, literally double the value. And then also there's the fragile component, which I think that's what scares most people off. But I don't know. I think when you look at Hellhorned as a clan, there's so many ways right now, especially with like the Steel Worker upgrade. There's just so many ways to get armor on your units, particularly your backliners, that I don't find fragiles as much as a downside as it's made out to be. But for that reason, I can't give it a 5-star. I think there's enough situations where you can't make the Ember work, or you have to go too far out of your way to get Ember upgrades with the floor pathing. And alternatively, sometimes fragile is something you can't deal with because of all the spikes and all the sweepers. You just don't have enough non-awkward ways to get armor on a backliner that this makes sense. Or a frontliner. You can use it on a frontliner too if the frontliner is one that can scale offensively. And for those reasons, I don't give it a 5, but I give it a strong 4. Like, it really is one of the... I can consistently make this work, I feel, and it's either doubling or tripling your damage if you double stack it. I mean, I honestly love to double stack it. And I think that's why I think it has gained value in the DLC slightly. I think the fragile is scarier now because of all the spikes and the trample. But as I mentioned, I think there's more ways to gain armor. But then also, I think double stack is more doable now because of things like Value Stone and kind of my aforementioned just the general ability to have more Ember nowadays, I think allows you much more to justify this double stack. But that's Onehorn's Tome, and that's basically the final one I got here. That's the final spell. Next, what we're gonna move on to is, I'll be honest, I haven't. I was planning to do champions. Maybe I'll just commit to that. I just didn't know which one. I have kind of two. The next two that I have planned are champions and just general win conditions, builds, and strategies. And I don't know which one should come first because I feel like both of them have some interlap that would be nice. Maybe I just combine them all in one. I don't know, but yeah, we'll see whatever the next one is. I haven't created that one yet, so might be a few days before the next one comes out. I think it'll be champions, but we'll see. As always, thanks for watching. Hope this was useful. Let me know if you have any strong disagreements or agreements with anything I've said here. I'm always learning a lot from the commenters because I definitely miss things too, right? I think it was Rough Lobster. Was it you that basically I made a big miss because actually Pirate Chomper is a pretty good infusion into Lodestone Totem, but I'm going off on a tangent now. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. As always, thanks for watching, and peace.